you think that designer brands use more or less synthetic materials than fast fashion brands? There are 1,731 designer brands listed on Farfetch alone, and on Essence there are 673, which begs the question, what does designer clothing mean today? I want to preface this video by saying that I love how so many people are being inspired to go off and create their own brands with their own artistic visions. But I also think that if you're starting a brand, you have a moral duty to consider the impact your products have on not only the environment, but also the people making your products as well. I know that's probably way too much to ask. Unfortunately, a lot of the designer brands that are popping up all over our Instagram feeds and our TikToks aren't really that much better than fast fashion.
They're just smaller.
And with how much I see millennials and Gen Z complaining about how boomers ruined the economy and the environment, and then turn around and post our thousands of Shein and H&M try-on hauls, we buy thousands of polyester hoodies and other disposable fashion, it just makes me really frustrated to see such cognitive dissonance in the name of consumerism. I understand the sentiment of, I'm just one person, what difference can I make? Because our singular efforts definitely seem futile, as well as the financial circumstances that'll pressure people to spend $200 on 50 Shein items instead of on 1 or 2 high-quality items that'll last 10 times as long. But I also think that's a mindset instilled in the consumer intentionally by big fast fashion to make us not really think about how much a garment should cost and the standards of quality clothing should maintain. Through the normalization of easy access to cheap clothing, fast fashion brands have really instilled in the customer the idea that spending $5, $10, or $20 on a garment is outrageous and that no garment should cost that much. Now, any publicly traded company like H&M or Zara have the obligation of their shareholders to increase profits each quarter.
Do you know what fiduciary responsibility means?
So it's in their best interest to minimize cost and maximize sales and profit. And fast fashion, by not having the image of high quality clothing to uphold, they're basically free to do whatever they want to get you to buy more and to increase their shareholder value through methods like planned obsolescence, sourcing potentially exploitative labor, and feeding on the consumer's desire to do good through greenwashing, where marketing tactics makes it seem like the products you're buying are more ethically produced than they really are. Fast fashion as a whole really relies on customers to be uninformed or just really not care about how their clothing is made. And if you're included in that, that's totally okay, and I'm not here to criticize you, because frankly, most people have far more important things to care about than where exactly their clothing is getting made. So once every few months, you might go out and buy a bunch of clothing at H&M and spend a couple $100s and think you're getting a great deal because you got a large quantity of clothing. But according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the average American wears a piece of clothing 7 to 10 times before throwing it out. And people generally have very short memories when it comes to how much they spend on clothing. So once they throw those pieces out, they'll generally just go back to the store a couple months later, buy another haul, and the cycle repeats itself.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
You cannot do this forever.
Actually, I can. This is how things are now.
But at the end of the day, you're spending more money on cheap quality clothing that won't last than you would if you just bought fewer items of higher quality. And that's something we hear a lot of people making fashion videos say, to just buy higher quality and all your problems will be solved.
If you're homeless, just buy a house.
But just buying higher quality items isn't as simple as it seems. Because like I said at the beginning, there are 1,731 designer brands on Farfetch and 673 on Essence, two very big online retailers for designer brands, which we often equate with high quality clothing. And just because a brand is labeled as designer or luxury doesn't mean that their products are being held to some high universal standard of quality. And I'd argue that with the very large amount of designer brands popping up everywhere, the status quo for quality in clothing is actively declining. And because the average consumer is so accustomed to low-quality garments from the prevalence of fast fashion, the people starting these emerging designer brands, who are consumers like the rest of us, may not actually know how to make a high-quality piece of clothing either. Now look at this tee and tell me how exactly you would make it better. What innovation can there possibly be in a garment just about the entire population of the world considers disposable? It's not an easy question to answer, not even for designers. And that's why t-shirts from Walmart are really not that different fundamentally to t-shirts from Gucci. And young designers, emerging brands, often don't have the money to both make high-quality clothing and clothing that's representative of their artistic vision. Their funding, or lack of it, requires them to compromise somewhere, and of course it's going to be in quality if their artistic vision could potentially get them noticed and make them go really big. When I think of designer clothing, I think of a specific name with a specific design aesthetic. Rick Owens, J.W. Anderson, Schiaparelli, and I perceive items from those brands to be very high quality, which to me means great materials and great construction and garments that were thoughtfully produced. When I think of luxury fashion, I think more of the experience around the product. High quality materials and construction, of course, but with an added emphasis on user experience and attention to detail throughout the entire garment's creation. Brands like Loro Piana, Brunello Cucinelli, Hermes, The Row. Brands that speak to a lifestyle and a feeling of inherent comfort and quality, not necessarily speaking to one designer's vision.
Here in my garage, just bought this new Lamborghini here. It's fun to...
But as much as I can nitpick the subtle differences between designer and luxury fashion, for all intents and purposes, they're practically the same, and they're used interchangeably between the majority of people. The concept of quality in clothing is something that I personally put a lot of value on. I work in fashion, I can't help myself, but I can't afford to buy whatever designer piece I want. So I save up over a long period of time to eventually buy something I love that will also fill a need in my wardrobe. I try to be very intentional with my purchases. And I don't want to give any financial advice here, but I actually have a separate bank account for my clothing purchases where only $50 is deposited into it every 2 weeks. But beyond that, and the occasional underwear or socks purchases, I don't spend any other money on clothing. So when I buy something, I really need to feel like I'm making an investment into my wardrobe and get something that is objectively high quality, not just because it's durable, but also because it's timeless. But lately, that's gotten harder to find. I actually started to think about this topic when my wife was looking for a new pair of pants, and she told me that she could barely find anything that wasn't made with polyester. Yet all the pants she was looking at were from entry-level designer brands that cost hundreds of dollars. Polyester is one of the cheapest materials you can use, and it's one of the most harmful to the planet. And then I started noticing it too, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to find natural fabrics. Yet I think many brands, from fast fashion to designer, are realizing that consumers don't really care. But I care, and if you're here, I'm hoping you do too. So I did some investigating. I was curious as to how many designer brands frequently use synthetic materials over natural. So I went on Essence's trending womenswear page, their most popular items right now. I took the first 16 trending garments, went to each of the brands those garments belong to, and recorded the material compositions of the top 30 products for each of those brands, giving me 480 total data points or styles. Then after that, I went and looked at the top items from major fast fashion brands to compare. Now, do you think that designer brands use more or less synthetic materials than fast fashion brands? Think about it. Now take a moment to guess what percent of those 480 styles I sampled from designer brands contain synthetic materials. I'll tell you right now, it was 56%. And all of this excludes trims, because trims are almost always synthetic. So this is just the main body composition. But 269 styles contain synthetic fibers. 28% of those 480 items were entirely synthetic, while 26% contain synthetic fibers in a blend with a natural fiber. But only 46% of those 480 styles were made entirely with natural fibers like wool, silk, or cotton. And these garments aren't cheap. Just about all of them are over $100 on the low end. Some brands were pretty good, surprisingly good, in most of their items being natural, like Vivienne Westwood, who 90% of their top items were completely natural, and Ekaslata and Ami Paris with 70% of their top 30 items being completely natural. And then a few brands were pretty subpar when it came to their material compositions, like Marine Serre with only 20% of their top 30 items being completely natural. However, Marine Serre kind of goes for a very synthetic look, and I want to note that most of Marine Serre's items that I sampled were labeled with recycled synthetic materials, which sounds good and makes you feel good, but synthetics can't really be recycled many times. The most common form of recycling, chemical recycling, uses very harmful chemicals. But recycled synthetics, in my opinion, aren't a whole lot better than virgin plastics. Are they better? Yes, but recycled synthetic fabrics are still likely using those damaging chemicals to only alter the usable lifespan of a plastic before it inevitably ends up in a landfill anyway. Now, looking back at the data, I thought it was pretty funny that Skims had 0% all natural fibers in their styles. Obviously, to get those body contouring garments, you're going to have to use something like elastic or spandex. But I do applaud them because 87% of their 30 styles at least had a blend with a natural fiber, although blends aren't biodegradable either. But it's still effort. And when compared to the next brand, Kim Kardashian and Skims are Mother Teresa. And to this next brand, and any other brand with similar fabric choices, please do better. The brand that by far performed the worst in my analysis of designer brands was called Poster Girl, and 90% of their top 30 most popular items were entirely synthetic. And the other 10% weren't natural, and they weren't even blends. They were aluminum, which I learned is actually one of the most sustainable metals that you can use because it can be recycled infinitely. But that doesn't really apply to aluminum clothing. More so aluminum cans and things like that, where recycling programs are in place to properly recycle and reuse them. No one's going to be pulling a metal dress out of a landfill to turn it back into a Coca-Cola can. But if you're an emerging designer and 90% of your top items are plastic, while the bio on your website talks about your luxurious quality and construction, maybe you should try for luxurious materials as well, because there's nothing luxurious about nylon and polyester. After I looked at these 16 designer brands, I went and got the same info from H&M, Zara, and Shein to see how they would compare. I went in assuming that the majority of these fast fashion styles would be entirely synthetic, but I was actually pleasantly surprised by one brand in particular. In my research, I discovered that only 22% of the 90 items I sampled from these brands were all natural. A very low number, but not entirely shocking for the price points these garments are at. 38% of the 90 items were entirely synthetic, only 10% more than the designer brands. And 40% were blended with a natural fiber, only 14% more than the designer brands. And Zara was actually the one that stood out and surprised me, because only 10% of their 30 most recent items, because they don't have a trending page, were entirely synthetic. Zara is definitely at a different price point than H&M and Shein. While still being fast fashion, I do think they're trying to lean more into thoughtful design. Like with their recent Zara Surplus collection, they're definitely trying to elevate their offerings. Now let's contrast Zara's numbers with Shein, who in their top 30 recommended products, because they also don't have trending, only 3.3% of those items were all natural. Only one garment was cotton, and 80% were entirely plastic. And I'm willing to bet that number would only go up if I managed to sample every one of the 10,000 products Shein releases each and every day. Thankfully, H&M was better than Shein and was actually fairly close to Zara in their material compositions, with 30% of the items I sampled being natural, 23% being synthetic, and around 47% being a blend. Overall, looking at these numbers between fast fashion and designer brands, the materials they use in terms of the fundamental composition were pretty similar. The more expensive brands are using more natural materials, but not by much. And I think that gap is closing because I'm willing to bet designers from the 50s to the 90s were using way more natural materials than we are today. And for such massive differences in price these garments are at, from the $5 shirts at H&M to the multi-hundreds of dollar shirts from Vivienne Westwood or any of those other brands, the actual prevalence of high quality natural materials is pretty low. The fabric is where we all start when buying a garment. We pick it up to see if it feels good, if it's comfortable against our skin. And if you're looking to improve your wardrobe, you should be looking for natural fibers. But I'm here to tell you that yes, it is harder to find natural materials in clothing than it used to be. They don't want us buying natural materials because plastics are cheaper. Fast fashion normalized plastic clothing, and it's catching on in emerging and designer brands. Remember, those 30 garments I sampled were trending. They're the ones being bought over the natural ones. Why is that? Is it because people tend to prioritize visual aesthetics over comfort and quality? And does the average consumer either not know about or just not care about the environmental impact of synthetic fabrics? Let me know your thoughts on these questions. I'm really interested to see what you all say, and whether or not you've been noticing this trend too, because I really think designer brands are changing. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.